Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. In this episode, we delve into the complex and urgent questions surrounding the conflict in Gaza and the broader implications for international humanitarian law. From António Guterres' powerful statement that international humanitarian law is not an a la carte menu, to the controversial use of AI in military targeting by the IDF, we explore the legal, ethical, and technological dimensions of modern warfare. We also examine the unprecedented involvement of both the ICC and ICJ, the role of the European states under the Geneva Conventions, and whether the current global response signals the erosion or evolution of humanitarian law in real time. My guest today is Vincent Chetail, Professor of International Law and Director of the Global Migration Center here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Vincent, thank you very much for joining us on this episode of What Matters Today. My first question for you is, António Guterres said international humanitarian law is not an a la carte menu. How do you interpret this statement in the context of the current conflict in Gaza, and what does it reveal about the challenges of applying humanitarian law impartially?
This is an important reminder. Impartiality of international humanitarian law is key in times of war, and it is particularly important in this armed conflict in Gaza, where proponents of both sides are extremely polarized. But as a matter of principle, international humanitarian law, or ICJ, to use its acronym, is binding upon all belligerents, regardless of their legitimacy and goals. So this means that ICJ does apply not to both parties in the conflict, notwithstanding the right of Israel to self-defense and the right of Palestine to self-determination. So from the angle of ICJ, it does not matter who is the aggressor and who is the victim. It does apply as soon as there is an armed conflict, and whatsoever the reason and cause for launching a war. So the rules are non-reciprocal. So they apply irrespective of what the other side has done. And typically, violations such as targeting civilians, imposing collective punishment, can never be justified by claiming that another party has committed violation. And this is at the very heart of humanitarian law. Otherwise, this is the end of law in armed conflict. And we are reintroducing the notion of just war. So this is, as such, an important reminder.
And the use of AI in military targeting by the IDF has raised some serious concerns. What are your thoughts on this?
It's true that IDF is using extensively AI in identifying the targets and also in using drones in executing the attacks. So it has used artificial intelligence to rapidly and automatically perform much of the process of determining what to bomb. And according to various sources, IDF have lowered down their criteria for selecting targets by increasing the previously accepted ratio of civilians to combatant casualties, in addition to the use of AI.
Yep.
And typically, to give a concrete example, which is well reported, low-ranking Hamas members, even if they are not combatant, are preferably targeted at home with their family. So clearly, this is a major issue in terms of civilian casualties, but also in terms of accountability,
right?
Clearly. But I should say that the use of AI is only one aspect of the war in Gaza. There is, in fact, a combination of new technology and old methods of warfare. And AI violations are simply more sophisticated, but there are also crude violations of ICJ carried out without assistance of AI.
The ICC and ICJ are both involved in legal proceedings related to this conflict. What does this dual litigation at the highest international level say about the gravity of the situation, and can it realistically lead to accountability?
This is a key issue here, and I shall start by saying that both sides have committed blatant war crimes, starting with Hamas military branch through its attack on Israeli civilians, hostage taking, use of human shields, and so on. As far as the Israeli army is concerned, the unprecedented number of civilian casualties and destruction in the Strip of Gaza goes far beyond what is accepted as a collateral damage in urban environment. We are talking about more than 60,000 deaths and 130,000 injured Palestinian in July 2025. So this is huge. And indeed, the UN has condemned and documented indiscriminate bombing of residential areas, targeted attack on hospital and medical personnel. And to give you simply a more concrete idea, only during the very first months of the Israeli offensive, the equivalent of 2 nuclear bombs was dropped in the Gaza Strip, which is one of the most densely populated areas in the world. So yes, the situation is extremely serious. And this is also the reason why both the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice are involved.
Right.
The ICC has issued an arrest warrant to Netanyahu and his defense ministers on several accounts: war crime of using starvation as a method of warfare, crime against humanity, and also from the other side, the commander-in-chief of the military branch of Hamas is also accused by ICC for crime against humanity and war crimes of torture, taking hostage. So clearly, the ICC is playing an important role in investigating alleged violation in this conflict, but it's true that its efforts are constrained by several limitations, including the lack of enforcement mechanisms, including jurisdictional challenges, lack of cooperation from key states, obviously Israel and the US. Neither is a member of the ICC, but also with a relative passivity of European countries also to help the ICC as such. There is another ongoing case that was brought before the International Court of Justice, ICJ, on January 23 by South Africa against Israel for genocide. So this is another case. And here, of course, the case is pending, but the ICJ already issued several temporary orders, including one finding a real and imminent risk of irreparable harm. So this is still an important acknowledgement, even if it does not amount to a conviction at this stage. But what is extremely disturbing is that the ICJ noted a number of particularly shocking statements among high-level officials, including the Minister of Defense, the President also, calling Palestinians as human animals, explaining that the whole nation is responsible. So clearly, even if this is still an ongoing case, rarely in history the intention to destroy a group has been so clearly formulated by state leaders. And this is quite new and in the history of international law. And at the very least, such statements will be sufficient to convict the authors for incitement to genocide, at least.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned European countries. So European countries are bound by the Geneva Conventions, but seem hesitant to act. What legal and moral responsibilities do European states have in this context, and what are the consequences of their inaction?
It's true that the hesitation of European states is troubling. It's probably due to many reasons. Many European leaders seem paralyzed. First of all, by the atrocity of the Hamas attack, of course. Also by the outrageous polarization of the conflict, and also the fear of accusation of anti-Semitism, in addition to the fact that Israel is considered as a traditional ally. So clearly, All these elements are part of the picture, but it remains that European countries have historic responsibility to ensure that humanitarian law is respected. And this is not only a basic duty of humanity, this is also a legal obligation.
Right.
As state parties to the Geneva Convention, they are obliged to prosecute violations before their own court for dual nationals or for members of Israeli armies in their territory during holidays and so on. I mean, clearly, there are two possible grounds here to investigate and prosecute perpetrators. So, and this abstention is not only a violation of international law, but also a source of impunity.
Right.
And the problem here is that no one will be able to say they didn't know, and the double standards of Western states is too obvious. Of course, double standards of Western foreign policy is not new, but it is more visible than ever as such. And this is here again another key issue at stake, because Western democracies are violating their most fundamental commitments to international law and human rights. And the rest of the world is watching them do so in real time. So the full consequences of this collective failure will be felt for decades to come. And this is another side effect of the war in Gaza.
And for my final question, do you believe international humanitarian law is still relevant and enforceable in modern conflicts, or are we witnessing its collapse in real time?
There are clearly many reasons to be disillusioned by the situation in the world, the numerous armed conflicts in the world, the systematic violations, the shocking toll of death, injury, the double standard of Western side, and so on. So clearly, there are many reasons to be pessimistic. I still believe that international humanitarian law is alive. First of all, this war in Gaza is not the first to be accompanied by flagrant violation, because we are talking about a situation of armed conflict. So applying law in times of war is inherently difficult as such. And a war without civilian casualties may happen, but this is quite rare in the history.
Right.
And obviously, situation of violence can lead those involved to lose all reference points. And so there are many reasons why war is also a source of violations as such. But again, this does not mean that there is no role for abiding rules, even in such extreme situation. And I will say that, first of all, no one contests the binding nature and legitimacy of humanitarian law. I mean, both Israel, the Palestinian armed group, have acknowledged the binding nature in this conflict and in all ongoing conflict in the world. Humanitarian law is grounded on universal rules, binding both states and armed groups, but ICJ is more fundamentally framed by universal values shared by all religions and all cultural traditions. So, in fact, humanitarian law does exist since the war exists in the history of humanity. So, it's important to have also some critical and historical distance. Second, humanitarian law is resilient. It is not a naive or idealistic law. In fact, the very content of international humanitarian law is to establish a balancing act between military necessity and humanitarian consideration. So it is not absolute, it does allow exceptions in particular instances. It is, and clearly the term law of war is perhaps a better label than humanitarian law. It does also reflect the real difficulties inherent to a situation of armed conflict. So it is not just only about a dream, but a quite realistic branch of law. And thirdly, I mean, I would say more generally, violations are always more visible than respect. And especially in a conflict like Gaza with such media coverage, obviously.
Yeah, very visible.
So to make a trivial comparison, it is not certain that humanitarian law is much more violated than the highway code and traffic regulations.
Right.
And law by nature does need violation to some extent, because without violation, there is no need for law. So we should keep this in mind as such. But of course, that being said, beyond the horrible toll of death, destruction, another very disturbing fact is the lack of political will, and especially the lack of political will of other states to ensure due respect for international humanitarian law. And this is, to me, also another key issue, because without political will and without a collective endeavor towards such important principles, of course, law may have a limited impact. And clearly, what is new today is also the fact that Western states are no longer pushing for due respect for IHL. And this is extremely worrisome. But again, I still believe in international humanitarian law and in the rule of law, because we must never forget that justice is just a matter of time.
Very well said. Thank you very much, Vincent, again for joining us on this episode and talking about this complex yet very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute Communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.